Welcome back to Fear Files. Today I am back with some deeply disturbing long-form Appalachian trail stories. In this episode, we will venture into the haunted depths of America's most mysterious mountain range with 9 harrowing tales of encounters that defy explanation, adapted from true events reported by hikers who barely escaped to tell their stories. Each narrative has been meticulously researched and compiled from first-hand accounts shared by those who claim to have experienced the unexplainable while traversing these ancient peaks and hollows. The Appalachian Trail stretches over 2,000 miles through some of the oldest mountains on Earth, and within these primordial forests lurk phenomena that challenge everything we think we know about reality. To protect the privacy of those involved, some names and specific locations have been altered, but the core experiences remain untouched in all their terrifying authenticity. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Fear Files for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what really exists in the shadows of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls from the depths of America's most haunted wilderness. Casson Mitchell had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 3 years, but he had never encountered anything quite like what happened to him in the remote sections of Shenandoah National Park during the autumn of 2023. At 22 years old, he considered himself an experienced solo hiker, someone who knew how to read trail markers, weather patterns, and the subtle signs that separated a peaceful wilderness experience from a potentially dangerous one. He had completed sections of the trail from Georgia to Maine, always meticulous about his planning, always respectful of the mountains that had become his second home. What occurred during those 48 hours near Hazel Mountain would forever change his relationship with the ancient peaks of Virginia and leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about the wilderness. The incident began on a crisp October morning when Casson was hiking a lesser-traveled section of the Appalachian Trail that winds through the heart of Shenandoah. He had been walking since dawn, enjoying the solitude and the spectacular fall foliage that painted the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds. The main trail was well marked and familiar, but around mid-morning, he noticed an unofficial path branching off to the east, marked only by a small cairn of stacked stones and what appeared to be an old blaze carved deep into the bark of a massive oak tree. The marking was unusual, not the standard white blazes of the Appalachian Trail, but rather a series of 3 parallel lines that looked weathered and ancient. Casson had heard about this particular area from posts in obscure hiking forums, where experienced trail veterans occasionally mentioned an unnamed hollow that supposedly contained the ruins of an old homestead from the 1800s. The descriptions were always vague, and GPS coordinates were never shared, but the consensus seemed to be that finding this place was worth the detour for anyone interested in the historical aspects of Appalachian settlement. Casson had always been fascinated by the stories of the early mountain families who had carved out lives in these remote hollows, and the prospect of discovering authentic ruins was too tempting to pass up. The unofficial trail descended sharply from the main path, winding through increasingly dense forest, where the canopy blocked out most of the morning sunlight. The further he walked, the more the woods seemed to close in around him, creating a sense of isolation that was both peaceful and slightly unnerving. The air grew cooler and more humid, carrying with it the rich scent of decaying leaves and moss-covered rocks. After about an hour of careful hiking down the steep and sometimes treacherous path, Casson found himself in a narrow hollow completely enclosed by steep ridges on 3 sides. The hollow itself was remarkably quiet, so much so that the silence seemed almost oppressive. There were no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzzing of insects that would normally populate such a biodiverse area during the warmer months of autumn. Even his own footsteps seemed muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves that covered the hollow floor. The trees here were ancient, their trunks massive and gnarled, their branches creating a canopy so thick that only filtered green light reached the ground below. It was in this supernatural quiet that Kaysen first heard the voices. At first, he dismissed the sound as wind moving through the trees, or perhaps the distant call of other hikers on the main trail far above. But as he stood perfectly still and listened carefully, the sounds became more distinct and undeniably human. They were voices, multiple voices speaking in what sounded like conversation, though the words were indistinct and seemed to be coming from deeper within the hollow. Curious and assuming he had encountered other explorers, Kaysen called out a friendly greeting, expecting to make contact with fellow hikers who might be able to share information about the area. His voice echoed strangely in the enclosed space, seeming to bounce off the surrounding ridges in ways that created multiple overlapping echoes. But instead of receiving a response, the mysterious voices stopped completely, leaving behind a silence so profound that Kaysen could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. After waiting several minutes for some kind of response, Kaysen decided to continue deeper into the hollow, following what appeared to be the remnants of an old path marked by occasional stone foundations and the scattered remains of what might once have been fence posts. The voices resumed as he walked, always seeming to stay just ahead of him, always just beyond the range where he could make out individual words, but clearly human and clearly engaged in some kind of ongoing conversation. As he pressed deeper into the hollow, Kaysen began to notice other oddities about the place. The trees, while ancient, showed signs of old damage that looked deliberate rather than natural. Many had deep gouges in their bark that appeared to be axe marks, but the wounds had healed over with decades of growth, suggesting they were very old. Some trees had been felled long ago, their massive trunks now serving as nurse logs for younger growth, but the cuts were clean and straight, indicating they had been harvested by people rather than brought down by storms or disease. The path he was following became more defined as he walked, revealing itself to be an old wagon road or cart path that had been used extensively at some point in the distant past. Stone retaining walls appeared on either side of the path, expertly built with the kind of dry stone masonry that characterized 19th century mountain construction. These walls were partially collapsed but still substantial enough to show the skill and effort that had gone into their construction. It was near these stone walls that the voices became clearer and more disturbing. Instead of the indistinct conversation he had been hearing, Kaysen began to make out individual words and phrases, and what he heard made his blood run cold. The voices were speaking in an archaic dialect that sounded like English, but with pronunciations and word choices that seemed to come from another century. More unsettling, they seemed to be talking about him directly, referring to him as the stranger and discussing his presence in their hollow. One voice, that of an older man with a thick mountain accent, kept repeating variations of, "He should not have come here, not to this place, not where the blood was spilled." Another voice, this one belonging to what sounded like a woman, responded with phrases like, "Send him away. Send him back to his own kind before the darkness falls again." A third voice, younger and more agitated, seemed to be arguing with the others, saying things like, "Let him see. Let him know what was done here. Let him carry the truth." Kaysen stopped walking and stood perfectly still, trying to determine the direction from which the voices were coming. They seemed to emanate from all around him, as if the speakers were positioned in a circle just beyond his sight, hidden by the dense undergrowth and the massive tree trunks that filled the hollow. When he called out again, asking if anyone was there, and explaining that he was just a hiker exploring the area, the voices stopped abruptly, leaving behind that same unnatural silence. But this time, when the silence fell, Kaysen became aware of something else that filled him with a deep sense of dread. Despite the fact that he was standing in a hollow that should have been sheltered from wind, he could feel air moving around him. Not a natural breeze, but rather deliberate currents that seemed to circle him like invisible presences examining him from all angles. The air carried with it a scent that was both familiar and horrifying. The metallic smell of old blood mixed with the musty odor of long abandoned places. Determined to solve the mystery and convinced that there had to be a logical explanation for what he was experiencing, Kaysen continued following the old road deeper into the hollow. The stone walls grew higher and more elaborate, eventually leading to what was unmistakably the foundation of a substantial building. The ruins were extensive, suggesting that this had once been a significant homestead, or perhaps even a small community settlement. Stone foundations outlined multiple structures, including what appeared to be a main house, several outbuildings, and even the remains of what might have been a mill or workshop near a small creek that ran through the lowest part of the hollow. But these ruins were not the peaceful historical site that Kaysen had expected to find. Instead of the gentle decay that usually characterized old Appalachian homesteads, these foundations showed signs of violence and destruction. Stones were scattered as if they had been deliberately thrown or blasted apart, and scorch marks on some of the remaining walls suggested that fire had played a role in whatever had happened here. Most disturbing of all, the ground around the ruins was marked with depressions and mounds that looked suspiciously like graves, though there were no headstones or other markers to indicate that this was an official cemetery. It was while he was examining these ominous mounds that the voices returned with a vengeance, no longer distant and conversational, but loud, angry, and clearly directed at him. The older man's voice boomed through the hollow, speaking in that same archaic dialect, but with unmistakable hostility. "You should not have come here, stranger, not to the place where our blood waters the earth." The woman's voice joined in, her tone filled with grief and rage. "They came in the night. They came with fire and blade. They took our children and left us to die." The younger voice, now clearly that of a child, began sobbing and repeating over and over, help us, do not let them be forgotten." Kaysen felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he realized that these were not the voices of living people, but something else entirely. Something connected to whatever tragedy had occurred in this place so many years ago. The voices continued to grow louder and more numerous, as if an entire community of the dead was speaking to him at once. They told a story of a family, the Caulfields, who had lived in this hollow for 3 generations, farming the fertile bottom land and living in relative isolation from the outside world. According to the voices, the Caulfield family had been murdered in the winter of 1847 by a group of men who had come seeking revenge for some perceived slight or dispute. The attackers had surrounded the hollow in the middle of the night, trapping the family in their homes before setting fire to the buildings and killing anyone who tried to escape. Men, women, and children had all perished, their bodies left unburied until spring, when distant relatives had finally come looking for them and found only bones and ashes. As this horrific story unfolded through the overlapping voices of the dead, Kaysen began to back away from the ruins, every instinct telling him that he needed to leave this place immediately. But as he turned to retrace his steps back up the old road, he found that the path behind him seemed to have changed. Where there had been a clear route leading back toward the main trail, now there were only dense thickets and impassable tangles of mountain laurel and rhododendron. The voices grew more insistent, pleading with him to stay and bear witness to their story, to carry their truth back to the world of the living so that their murders would not be forgotten. But there was something in their tone that suggested this was not entirely a request. The air around him grew colder, and shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, reaching toward him like grasping fingers. The scent of blood grew stronger, mixed now with the smell of smoke and burning wood. Panic began to set in as Kaysen realized that he might be trapped in this hollow with whatever remained of the Caulfield family. He pulled out his GPS device, hoping to navigate his way out, but the screen showed only static and error messages. His cell phone had no signal, which was not unusual in these remote areas, but even the basic functions seemed to be malfunctioning. The compass on his watch spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, and even his analog watch had stopped working, the hands frozen at 3:17. The voices were now coming from all directions at once, a cacophony of the dead demanding justice, demanding remembrance, demanding that he join them in their eternal vigil in this cursed hollow. Kaysen began to run, crashing through underbrush and scrambling over fallen logs, desperate to find any way out of the valley. Behind him, the voices followed, their tone turning from pleading to threatening, warning him that no one who learned their secret would be allowed to leave alive. After what felt like hours of desperate flight through increasingly treacherous terrain, Kaysen finally found himself back on the main Appalachian Trail, gasping for breath and covered in scratches from his panicked escape through the dense forest. The sun was setting, though according to his memory, he had only been in the hollow for a few hours during the middle of the day. His watch was working again, showing that somehow an entire day had passed, though he had no memory of how that time had been spent. When Kaysen reached civilization 2 days later, he immediately began researching the history of the area around Hazel Mountain, particularly looking for any records of a family named Caulfield. What he found confirmed his worst fears and validated the story the voices had told him. In the archives of the Virginia Historical Society, he discovered newspaper accounts from 1847 describing the brutal murder of the Caulfield family, exactly as the voices had described. The killers had never been caught, and the family's remote homestead had been abandoned and eventually forgotten, lost to the wilderness that had reclaimed it. Kaysen never returned to that section of the Appalachian Trail, and he has never spoken publicly about his experience in the Whispering Hollow until now. But on quiet nights, especially during the autumn months when the anniversary of the massacre approaches, he still sometimes hears those voices calling to him across the years, reminding him that some tragedies leave wounds in the landscape that never fully heal, and that the dead do not always rest quietly in their mountain graves. Jaslyn Carmichael had always been drawn to the mysterious interplay between light and shadow that occurs during the golden hours of dawn and dusk in the mountains, which is what brought her to one of the most remote and less traveled sections of the Blue Ridge Mountains near Mount Mitchell in early September of 2023. At 24 years old, she had already established herself as a talented nature photographer whose work had been featured in several regional magazines, and she was always seeking out new locations that would allow her to capture the unique beauty of the Appalachian wilderness. What she experienced during what should have been a routine photography expedition would challenge everything she believed about the nature of time and space. leaving her with images that defied logical explanation and memories that still haunt her dreams. Jaslyn had risen well before dawn, on what promised to be a perfect September morning, driving the winding mountain roads in darkness to reach a trailhead that would give her access to a remote overlook she had discovered through careful study of topographic maps and satellite imagery. This particular vantage point was not marked on any tourist maps and required a challenging 2-mile hike through dense forest to reach. But her previous scouting trip had revealed that it offered spectacular views of the layered ridges that stretch endlessly toward the horizon in this part of North Carolina. The hike to the overlook had gone exactly as planned, with Jaslyn reaching her destination about 30 minutes before sunrise, giving her time to set up her camera equipment and scout the best angles for capturing the dramatic lighting that would occur as the sun crested the eastern ridges. The overlook itself was a narrow granite ledge that jutted out from the mountainside, offering unobstructed views across miles of pristine wilderness. Ancient gnarled trees clung to the rocky outcroppings around the ledge, their twisted branches creating natural frames for her compositions. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Jaslyn lost herself in her work, capturing dozens of images as the light shifted and changed across the landscape below. The morning was absolutely perfect for photography, with just enough mist in the valleys to create depth and mystery while still allowing the distant ridges to remain visible through the haze. She spent nearly 2 hours on the overlook, working with different lenses and compositions, completely absorbed in the creative process that had become her passion and profession. It was while she was changing memory cards in her camera that Jaslyn noticed an unusual stone formation near the edge of the overlook, a cluster of quartz crystals that seemed to capture and reflect the morning light in fascinating ways. The crystals were embedded in the granite bedrock, but one piece, about the size of her palm and shot through with veins of deep purple amethyst, had apparently broken free from the main formation. The loose stone was beautiful, unlike anything she'd seen in her years of hiking through these mountains. And without really thinking about it, she slipped it into her camera bag as a souvenir of what had been a particularly successful morning of photography. By the time Jaslyn had finished her shooting session and packed up her equipment, the sun was well above the horizon, and she was eager to begin the hike back to her car. She had other locations she wanted to visit before the light became too harsh for effective photography, and she was already mentally planning her next shots as she started down the trail that led away from the overlook. The path was narrow but well-defined, winding through dense rhododendron thickets and stands of ancient hardwood trees that created a cool, shaded tunnel through the forest. But something was wrong with the trail, though it took Jaslyn nearly an hour of hiking to realize it. Despite following what appeared to be a clear and consistent path, despite walking steadily downhill in what she was certain was the correct direction, she kept encountering the same distinctive rock formation over and over again. It was an unusual outcropping of granite that had been split by some ancient geological force, creating a narrow passage between two towering stone walls that were decorated with patches of bright green moss and delicate ferns. The first time she saw the rock formation, Jaslyn assumed she had simply reached a part of the trail she had not noticed during her pre-dawn hike to the overlook. The second time she encountered the same rocks, she began to worry that she had somehow gotten turned around and was walking in circles. But by the third time she found herself standing in front of the identical granite passage, she knew that something was seriously wrong. Jaslyn stopped and carefully examined her surroundings, trying to understand how she could possibly be seeing the same rock formation repeatedly when she was certain she had been walking in a straight line downhill the entire time. She checked her compass, only to discover that the needle was spinning wildly, unable to settle on any consistent direction. Her GPS device showed only error messages, and even her cell phone seemed to be malfunctioning, with the time display flickering between different readings and the signal bars fluctuating randomly. Determined to solve the problem through logic and careful observation, Jaslyn decided to mark her passage through the rock formation by stacking small stones into a cairn that would be visible if she somehow ended up back at the same location. She then chose what appeared to be the most direct path away from the rocks, walking carefully and paying close attention to every landmark she passed, trying to create a mental map that would help her avoid whatever navigation error she was making. But 20 minutes later, she was back at the granite passage, and her carefully constructed cairn was exactly where she had left it. This time, she tried a completely different route, heading in what her instincts told her should be the opposite direction. The result was the same. After walking for what felt like miles through forest that never seemed to repeat or become familiar, she found herself once again standing in front of the moss-covered rocks and her stone marker. As the morning stretched into afternoon and then toward evening, Jaslyn became increasingly desperate and confused. No matter which direction she chose, no matter how carefully she tried to navigate by the sun or by the natural features of the landscape, she always ended up back at the same granite formation. She tried following streams, thinking they would lead her downhill and eventually to roads or civilization. But even the water seemed to flow in impossible directions, sometimes appearing to run uphill before disappearing into underground channels that led nowhere. It was during one of these increasingly frantic attempts to escape what seemed to be some kind of geographical trap that Jaslyn encountered the other hikers. At first, she was relieved to see other people, hoping they could help her understand what was happening and perhaps guide her back to the main trail. But her relief quickly turned to horror as she realized that these people were experiencing the same impossible phenomenon that had trapped her. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in hiking gear that looked worn and dirty, as if they had been on the trail for much longer than a normal day hike would require. Their faces showed the strain of exhaustion and confusion, and when they saw Jaslyn approaching, their expressions revealed a mixture of hope and despair that she found deeply disturbing. The woman, who appeared to be in her 30s, was the first to speak, and her words sent chills down Jaslyn's spine. "How long have you been walking the loop?" she asked, her voice hoarse with fatigue. "We have been trying to get out for 3 days now, but we keep ending up back at those same rocks no matter what we do." One of the men, older and wearing a faded baseball cap, nodded grimly and added, "The compass does not work, the GPS does not work, and time seems to move differently here." Look at our watches. What Jaslyn saw when the 3 hikers showed her their timepieces defied all logic and reason. Despite the fact that they claimed to have been hiking together for days, their watches showed completely different times. The woman's watch read 2:47, one man's showed 11:23, and the other displayed 8:15. Even more disturbing, none of these times seemed to correspond to what Jaslyn's own watch was showing, which had been flickering between different readings all day, but currently displayed 6:33. The trapped hikers went on to describe their experience in terms that matched exactly what Jaslyn had been going through. They had all started from different trailheads on what were supposed to be routine day hikes, but each had become lost in the same impossible loop that seemed to defy the basic laws of geography and physics. They had tried everything they could think of to escape, including attempting to climb over the ridges that surrounded the area, but every route led them back to the granite passage and its inexplicable stone marker. As darkness began to fall and the temperature dropped, the four trapped hikers made the decision to spend the night together, rather than continue their futile attempts to escape in the dark. They found a relatively sheltered spot near the rock formation and shared what food and water they had, though Jaslyn noticed that no one seemed to be getting hungry or thirsty despite their extended ordeal. Time itself seemed to be behaving strangely, with periods that felt like hours passing in what should have been minutes, while other moments seemed to stretch out endlessly. It was during the long, strange night that Jaslyn began to suspect that the unusual stone she had picked up at the overlook might somehow be connected to their predicament. As she sat examining the purple-veined quartz in the light of her flashlight, she noticed that the crystal seemed to pulse with its own internal light, and that the pulsing seemed to correspond to the fluctuations in her watch and other electronic devices. Acting on nothing more than desperate intuition, Jaslyn stood up and walked to the edge of their camp, then threw the crystal as far as she could into the darkness beyond the granite passage. The moment the stone left her hand, she felt a subtle shift in the air around her, as if some invisible tension had suddenly been released. Her watch stopped flickering and settled on a steady reading. Her compass needle swung to point steadily north, and the oppressive feeling that had been weighing on all of them seemed to lift like fog dissipating in sunlight. When morning came, the other three hikers were gone, vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Jaslyn found herself alone at the granite passage, but this time when she chose a direction and began walking, the trail led her steadily downhill through changing scenery until she eventually reached the familiar trailhead where her car was parked. The entire experience had lasted less than 24 hours, according to her watch, though it had felt like days or even weeks while she was trapped in the loop. When Jaslyn later developed the photographs she had taken that morning at the overlook, she discovered that several of the images showed impossible shadows and light patterns that could not be explained by the position of the sun or the surrounding landscape. In some shots, shadows fell in multiple directions at once, as if cast by several different light sources. In others, the shadows seemed to move between frames taken only seconds apart, creating patterns that defied the laws of physics and photography. Jaslyn has never returned to that section of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and she has never found another crystal like the one that seemed to trap her in that temporal anomaly. But sometimes, when she is developing photographs taken in other remote locations, she finds similar impossible shadows in her images, and she wonders if there are other places in these ancient mountains where time and space operate according to rules that human science has yet to understand. Sincere Matthews had been involved with Boy Scouts since he was 6 years old, earning his Eagle Scout rank at 17 and continuing as a volunteer leader through his college years. So when Troop 847 from Martinsburg asked him to conduct a solo scouting expedition to evaluate campsites along the Appalachian Trail near Harper's Ferry for an upcoming youth backpacking trip, he accepted the assignment with confidence. At 20 years old, he had logged hundreds of hours in the backcountry of West Virginia and Maryland, and he considered himself well prepared for any challenges the wilderness might present. What he encountered during 3 days in October of 2023 would test not only his outdoor skills, but also his fundamental understanding of what was possible in the remote forests of the eastern United States. The purpose of Sincere's trip was straightforward and routine. Evaluate the condition of designated backcountry campsites, assess water sources, identify potential hazards, and determine which locations would be most suitable for a group of 12 teenagers on their first extended backpacking experience. The section of the Appalachian Trail he was assigned to scout runs through some of the most historically significant terrain in the eastern United States, passing through areas where Civil War battles were fought and where early American settlers had carved homesteads out of the dense mountain forests centuries earlier. Sincere began his expedition on a crisp Thursday morning in mid-October, when the fall foliage was at its peak and the weather forecast promised 3 days of clear skies and moderate temperatures. He carried a lightweight solo tent, sufficient food and water for his planned itinerary, and all the standard safety and navigation equipment that his years of scouting experience had taught him were essential for solo wilderness travel. His first planned campsite was at a designated backcountry location about 8 miles from the trailhead, positioned in a hollow that offered both water access and natural wind protection. The hike to his first campsite proceeded without incident, following well-maintained trail through beautiful hardwood forest that was ablaze with autumn colors. Sincere made good time and reached his intended camping area in the early afternoon, giving him plenty of time to thoroughly explore the site and evaluate its suitability for the youth group. The location was ideal in most respects: a level area large enough for multiple tents, reliable water from a small creek, and adequate space for group activities and cooking. The only unusual feature was the abundance of old mining artifacts scattered throughout the area, remnants of coal extraction operations that had been active in these mountains during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As an experienced outdoorsman, Sincere was familiar with the mining history of this region and knew that abandoned mine entrances could be found throughout the mountains of West Virginia. During his site evaluation, he located and marked the positions of 3 old mine openings within a quarter mile of the campsite, noting them as potential hazards that would need to be discussed with the youth group during their visit. The mines appeared to have been sealed long ago, but Sincere knew that such barriers could deteriorate over time, and that curious teenagers might be tempted to explore areas that could be dangerous. After completing his evaluation of the campsite and surrounding area, Sincere set up his tent and prepared for what he expected to be a quiet evening of reviewing his notes and planning the next day's itinerary. The sun set early in the deep hollow where he was camped, but the clear skies promised a bright moon that would provide adequate light for any nighttime activities that might be necessary. He prepared a simple dinner on his camp stove, completed his daily log entries, and was settled into his sleeping bag by 9 o'clock, planning to rise early for the next segment of his scouting expedition. Sincere was awakened sometime after midnight by the sound of a child singing somewhere in the forest around his campsite. At first, still groggy from sleep, he assumed the sound was part of a dream, or perhaps the wind moving through the trees in a way that created the illusion of human voices. But as he lay in his tent listening carefully, the singing became clearer and more obviously human. A young voice, probably that of a girl around 8 or 9 years old, singing what sounded like an old folk song or lullaby. The singing was coming from somewhere beyond the creek that ran along the edge of his campsite, deeper in the forest where the old mining operations had left a maze of overgrown roads and forgotten clearings. Sincere checked his watch and saw that it was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, which made the presence of a child in such a remote location both puzzling and concerning. He had registered his camping plans with the local ranger station, and he knew that no other camping permits had been issued for this area during his planned visit. Sincere emerged from his tent and stood listening carefully, trying to determine the direction and distance of the singing. The voice was definitely that of a young child, and the song was hauntingly beautiful, a melody he did not recognize, but that had the timeless quality of traditional Appalachian folk music. The singing would continue for several minutes at a time, then stop completely before beginning again with a different song, or sometimes repeating the same melody with slight variations. As someone trained in wilderness safety and responsible for the welfare of young people in outdoor settings, Sincere felt obligated to investigate the situation. A child alone in the forest at this hour could be in serious danger, possibly separated from family members, or lost from a camping group that had not properly registered their presence in the area. He dressed quickly, gathered his flashlight and first aid kit, and began following the sound of the singing deeper into the forest beyond his campsite. The terrain beyond the creek was rough and overgrown, crisscrossed with old logging roads and mining paths that had been reclaimed by decades of forest growth. Sincere moved carefully through the darkness, using his flashlight sparingly to preserve the battery life while following the sound of the child's voice, which seemed to stay consistently ahead of him, no matter how quickly he tried to close the distance. The singing would stop whenever he paused to get his bearings, then resume when he began moving again, always from a location that seemed to be just beyond the range of his flashlight. After following the elusive voice for nearly an hour through increasingly difficult terrain, Sincere found himself in a small clearing dominated by the entrance to what appeared to be a major mining operation. Unlike the smaller mine openings he had found earlier near his campsite, this entrance was large enough to drive equipment through, and despite being abandoned for decades, the wooden timbers that framed the opening appeared to be in relatively good condition. The singing was now coming from inside the mine, echoing strangely off the stone walls and creating harmonics that made it sound as if multiple children were singing together. Sincere examined the ground around the mine entrance with his flashlight and discovered something that made his blood run cold. In the soft earth near the opening, he could clearly see small footprints, the kind that would be made by a child wearing sneakers or lightweight hiking boots. The prints led directly from the forest to the mine entrance and then disappeared into the darkness beyond the wooden timbers. The singing continued from deep within the mine, sometimes seeming to come from just beyond the entrance, and other times echoing as if it originated from far underground in the network of tunnels that extended into the mountain. Sincere called out, identifying himself as a scout leader and asking if anyone needed help, but his voice only created more echoes that mingled with the child's song in disturbing ways. As he stood at the entrance to the mine trying to decide whether he should attempt to enter and locate the source of the singing, the voice suddenly changed in a way that transformed his concern into terror. What had been the sweet, innocent voice of a young child became, without any transition or warning, the deep, harsh voice of an adult man calling for help from somewhere deep in the mine. The adult voice was urgent and desperate, calling out warnings about cave-ins and flooding, pleading for someone to bring rope and rescue equipment. But what made the situation truly horrifying was that the voice began describing Sincere's campsite in perfect detail, mentioning his blue tent, his camp stove, the way he had arranged his gear, and even the notes he had been writing in his journal before going to sleep. The voice knew details that no one could have known unless they had been watching him throughout the evening, and it began calling him by name, begging him to come deeper into the mine to provide assistance. The voice claimed to be a miner who had been trapped for days, who had seen Sincere's campsite and had been trying to attract his attention by mimicking a child's voice because he knew that would be more likely to draw someone into the forest. But there were inconsistencies in the story that made no sense, references to mining equipment and techniques that had not been used in these mountains for 50 years, and mentions of people and places that Sincere knew from his local history studies had not existed for decades. The voice was becoming more insistent and demanding, describing the layout of his campsite with impossible accuracy, and growing angry when Sincere did not immediately enter the mine to provide assistance. Sincere backed away from the mine entrance as every instinct he had developed through years of wilderness experience told him that he was in serious danger. The voice followed him, becoming louder and more threatening, describing not only his current campsite, but also his planned route for the following day and the locations where he intended to camp on subsequent nights. The voice knew details about his scouting mission that he had not shared with anyone, information that was contained only in the notes he had written in his private journal. He ran through the dark forest, abandoning any attempt at stealth or caution, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over fallen logs in his desperate flight back to his campsite. Behind him, the voice continued calling from the mine entrance, alternating between pleas for help and increasingly detailed descriptions of his personal belongings and travel plans. The voice seemed to follow him through the forest, always staying the same distance behind, always knowing exactly where he was and where he was going. Sincere reached his campsite, quickly broke down his tent and packed his gear, and began hiking out of the area by moonlight, abandoning his planned scouting expedition and heading directly back to the trailhead. He did not stop moving until he reached his car, and he did not sleep until he was back in his apartment in Martinsburg, with locked doors and electric lights to keep the darkness at bay. When Sincere submitted his report to Troop 847, he recommended that they choose a different section of the Appalachian Trail for their youth backpacking trip, citing concerns about unstable terrain and abandoned mining hazards. He never mentioned the singing child or the voice in the mine, and he has never returned to that hollow near Harper's Ferry, where something that knew far too much about him still calls from the darkness underground. Crew Thompson had always approached his geological studies with the same methodical precision that had earned him admission to Virginia Tech's competitive earth sciences program. But nothing in his 23 years of academic training had prepared him for what he would discover during his thesis research in the remote sections of the Appalachian Trail near McAfee Knob in the autumn of 2023. As a graduate student specializing in the structural geology of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Crew had spent months planning a solo field expedition to collect rock samples and document geological formations in an area that had received limited scientific attention due to its difficult access and rough terrain. What began as a routine research project would evolve into an encounter with forces that challenged everything he believed about the relationship between the past and present in these ancient mountains. Crew's thesis focused on the metamorphic processes that had shaped the Blue Ridge during various periods of mountain building activity over the past several 100 million years, and the area near McAfee Knob offered ideal opportunities to study rock formations that preserved evidence of these ancient geological events. His research plan called for 5 days of intensive fieldwork, camping in designated backcountry sites while systematically collecting samples from specific formations that he had identified through satellite imagery and topographic analysis. He carried specialized geological equipment, including rock hammers, sample containers, and a portable spectrometer, along with standard camping gear and detailed maps of the area. The section of the Appalachian Trail, where Crew planned to conduct his research, passes through terrain that has been shaped by both geological forces and human history, with evidence of Civil War military activity scattered throughout the mountains in the form of old roads, earthworks, and campsites. As someone who had studied the geological history of the region extensively, Crew was aware that this area had seen significant military action during the war, but his focus was entirely on the rocks themselves and the stories they could tell about processes that had occurred millions of years before humans ever set foot in these mountains. Crew established his first research camp on a Tuesday evening in early October, choosing a level area near a reliable water source that would give him easy access to the rock outcrops he needed to study. The weather was perfect for fieldwork, with clear skies and moderate temperatures that made the physically demanding work of sample collection both pleasant and productive. He spent his first evening reviewing his research plan and preparing his equipment for the intensive work that would begin at first light the following morning. It was during his second night in the field that Crew first experienced the phenomenon that would transform his understanding of what was possible in these mountains. He had spent a productive day collecting samples from a series of metamorphic rock formations, documenting their mineral compositions and structural characteristics, and was settled into his sleeping bag by 10 o'clock, planning to rise early for another full day of fieldwork. He was awakened sometime after midnight by sounds that seemed to come from all around his campsite. The rhythmic tramping of many feet, the creaking of leather equipment, and the low murmur of human voices speaking in accents and dialects that sounded distinctly different from modern American English. At first, Crew assumed that he was experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by exhaustion from his demanding fieldwork. But as he lay perfectly still in his tent, the sounds became more distinct and obviously real. He could hear what sounded like a large group of men moving through the forest around his campsite, their footsteps creating a steady rhythm that suggested military formation and discipline. The voices were speaking in conversational tones, discussing topics that seemed to relate to military operations, supply shortages, and the challenges of mountain warfare. Crew emerged from his tent with his flashlight, expecting to find evidence of other campers, or perhaps a military training exercise, but his light revealed only the familiar forest around his campsite, with no signs of human presence or activity. The sounds continued even as he searched the area with his flashlight, always seeming to come from just beyond the range of his beam, always maintaining the same character of organized military movement and quiet conversation. As the night progressed, the phenomenon became more intense and more clearly defined. Crew began to see shadowy figures moving between the trees around his campsite, indistinct forms that appeared to be wearing uniforms and carrying equipment from a much earlier historical period. The figures moved with purpose and organization, following routes through the forest that seemed to correspond to old roads and trails that Crew had noticed during his geological mapping of the area. The most disturbing aspect of these nocturnal visitations was that the ghostly soldiers seemed to be aware of Crew's presence and were actively trying to communicate with him. Individual figures would approach his campsite and appeared to be speaking directly to him, their voices becoming clearer and more urgent as they drew closer. They spoke in the regional dialects and speech patterns of the mid-19th century, using vocabulary and expressions that Crew recognized from his readings about Civil War history. The soldiers told stories of battles fought in these very mountains, of supply lines that had been cut off by enemy action, of wounded comrades who had died far from home in these remote forests. They spoke of hunger and cold, of the constant fear of enemy ambush, and of the desperate homesickness that plagued men who had been away from their families for months or years. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to believe that the war was still ongoing and that Crew was either a potential ally who could provide assistance or an enemy who needed to be questioned about his presence in their territory. Night after night, as Crew continued his geological research during the day, the spectral soldiers returned to his campsite with increasing frequency and intensity. What had begun as vague sounds and indistinct shadows evolved into detailed, interactive encounters with individual soldiers who spoke to him as if he were a living participant in events that had occurred more than a century and a half earlier. They asked him about troop movements, supply convoys, and enemy positions, expecting him to provide information that would help them in their ongoing military operations. The soldiers described battles and skirmishes that Crew was able to verify through historical research, mentioning specific dates, locations, and military units that corresponded exactly to documented Civil War engagements in this region. They knew details about the terrain, the weather, and the strategic importance of various mountain passes that demonstrated intimate familiarity with the area during the war years. Their knowledge was so accurate and detailed that Crew became convinced he was somehow experiencing direct contact with the memories or spirits of actual Civil War soldiers who had served in these mountains. As his research progressed, Crew began to notice that his geological work was revealing physical evidence that correlated with the stories the ghostly soldiers were telling him. In areas where they described campsites, he found fragments of metal and glass that appeared to be from the Civil War period. Where they mentioned battles, he discovered concentrations of lead bullets and other military artifacts buried in the soil. The geological formations themselves seemed to preserve traces of the human activity that had occurred during the war, as if the rocks and soil had somehow absorbed and retained the memories of the events that had taken place there. The climax of Crew's supernatural experiences occurred on his final night in the field, when the ghostly soldiers made their most direct and urgent appeal for his assistance. A Confederate officer, distinguished by his more elaborate uniform and authoritative bearing, approached Crew's campsite and began describing a desperate situation that required immediate action. According to the officer, a group of wounded soldiers was trapped in a cave system not far from Crew's location, cut off from medical assistance, and in danger of being discovered by Union forces. The officer provided detailed directions to the cave, describing landmarks and terrain features that Crew recognized from his geological mapping. He begged Crew to carry messages to the trapped soldiers' families, providing names and addresses in Virginia and North Carolina that he insisted must be contacted immediately. The officer's desperation was palpable, his voice breaking with emotion as he described the suffering of the wounded men and the urgency of getting word to their loved ones before it was too late. But there were aspects of the officer's story that made no logical sense. References to people and places that Crew knew from his historical research had been destroyed or abandoned decades after the Civil War ended. The messages the officer wanted him to deliver were addressed to people who had been dead for generations, to towns that no longer existed, to a world that had vanished long before Crew was born. Yet the officer's emotion and urgency were so genuine, his knowledge of the terrain so accurate, that Crew found himself seriously considering whether he should attempt to locate the cave the officer had described. On his final morning in the field, as Crew was packing his geological samples and preparing to hike out of the research area, he made a discovery that provided the final piece of evidence for the reality of his supernatural encounters. While collecting his last rock samples from an outcrop near his campsite, he found a collection of Civil War military artifacts that had been carefully placed in a natural crevice in the rock formation. The artifacts included uniform buttons, a brass belt buckle, fragments of leather equipment, and a small metal locket containing a photograph of a young woman and a child. The artifacts were in remarkable condition, protected from the elements by their placement in the rock crevice, and they corresponded exactly to items that the ghostly soldiers had described during their nocturnal visits. The locket, in particular, matched the description of a keepsake that the Confederate officer had mentioned, containing a photograph of his wife and daughter, who were waiting for him in Richmond. The discovery provided tangible proof that the soldiers' crew had encountered were not mere hallucinations or dreams, but rather some form of genuine contact with the past that had been preserved in this ancient landscape. When Crew returned to Virginia Tech and began analyzing his rock samples and field data, he found that the geological formations he had studied contained unusual mineral compositions and structural characteristics that defied conventional explanation. Some samples showed evidence of crystalline structures that seemed to preserve electromagnetic signatures, as if the rocks themselves had somehow recorded and retained the energy patterns associated with the intense human emotions that had been experienced in that location during the Civil War. Crew never submitted his thesis research for publication, and he never returned to the field site near McAfee Knob where he had encountered the ghostly soldiers. But he kept the Civil War artifacts he had found, and on quiet evenings when the wind is blowing through the mountains, he sometimes takes out the metal locket and looks at the photograph of the young woman and child, wondering if the Confederate officer ever made it home to Richmond, and whether somewhere in these ancient rocks, the memories of those who fought and died in these mountains continue to wait for someone who will listen to their stories and carry their messages to a world that has long since forgotten their sacrifice. Journey Henderson had always prided herself on being an excellent judge of character, someone who could read people quickly and accurately during her years of solo backpacking adventures across the eastern United States. At 21 years old, she had accumulated thousands of miles of hiking experience and had developed the social skills that come from meeting fellow travelers on remote trails, where the ability to quickly assess whether someone was trustworthy could be the difference between a pleasant encounter and a dangerous situation. What happened to her during a solo backpacking trip along the Appalachian Trail near Pine Grove, Furnace State Park in Pennsylvania, during the spring of 2023 would shake her confidence in her ability to distinguish between reality and something far more sinister that walks these ancient mountain paths. Journey was 3 days into a planned week-long solo hike through one of the most historically rich sections of the Appalachian Trail, an area where the path winds through landscapes that have been shaped by centuries of human activity, ranging from early colonial settlements to Civil War battles, to the industrial development of the 19th and 20th centuries. She had chosen this section specifically because of its reputation for excellent trail conditions and reliable water sources, factors that made it ideal for solo female hikers who needed to balance adventure with reasonable safety precautions. The weather had been perfect for hiking, with clear spring skies and moderate temperatures that made the challenging terrain both enjoyable and manageable. Journey had been making excellent time on her planned itinerary, staying in designated shelters and established campsites that provided both security and opportunities to meet other hikers who could share information about trail conditions and interesting features along the route. Her experience so far had been everything she had hoped for in a solo adventure. Solitude when she wanted it, beautiful scenery, and just enough interaction with fellow hikers to keep the journey interesting without compromising her independence. It was on the morning of her 4th day that Journey had her first encounter with the hiker, who would later cause her to question everything she thought she knew about the nature of reality in these mountains. She had broken camp early and was making good progress along a section of trail that ran through dense hardwood forest when she met a man coming from the opposite direction who stopped to chat about trail conditions and share information about water sources and camping opportunities ahead. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, wearing well-maintained hiking gear that suggested he was an experienced outdoorsman. He was friendly and knowledgeable about the area, providing helpful information about a water source that had been reported as unreliable in her trail guide, but which he assured her was flowing well and safe to drink from. He mentioned that he had camped near the water source the previous night and had found it to be an ideal location for an overnight stop with level 10 sights and good protection from wind. Their conversation lasted about 30 minutes, covering topics that ranged from trail conditions to wildlife sightings to recommendations for other sections of the Appalachian Trail that were worth visiting during the spring hiking season. The man was articulate and well-informed, sharing detailed knowledge about the local area that could only have come from extensive personal experience hiking in these mountains. He seemed genuine and trustworthy, the kind of fellow hiker that Journey had learned to appreciate during her years of solo travel. Someone who understood trail etiquette and the unwritten code of mutual assistance that exists among serious backpackers. When they parted ways, the man heading south while Journey continued north, she felt good about the encounter and looked forward to using the information he had provided about the water source and camping area that lay ahead on her route. The conversation had been exactly the kind of positive interaction that made solo hiking both safe and enjoyable, providing practical information while reinforcing the sense of community that exists among people who share a passion for wilderness travel. 2 hours later, as Journey was approaching the area where the man had told her she would find the reliable water source, she was surprised to encounter the same hiker again, this time walking in the same direction she was traveling rather than coming from the opposite direction as he had been during their first meeting. He appeared to be wearing exactly the same clothing and carrying the same pack, and he looked exactly as he had during their previous conversation, showing no signs of having hiked any significant distance since their last encounter. When Journey called out a friendly greeting and commented on seeing him again so soon, the man stopped and engaged in conversation exactly as he had done before, but with one crucial difference. He seemed to have no memory of their previous meeting. He introduced himself using the same name and provided the same information about trail conditions and water sources, using almost identical words and expressions that he had used during their conversation 2 hours earlier. Initially, Journey assumed that the man was simply absent-minded or perhaps was testing her memory as some kind of unusual joke. But as their conversation continued, it became clear that he genuinely had no recollection of their previous encounter. When she mentioned specific details from their earlier conversation, including his recommendations about the water source and his description of the camping area where he claimed to have spent the previous night, he looked at her with confusion and denied having provided such information. The man insisted that this was their first meeting and seemed puzzled by her references to their previous conversation. He provided the same information about the water source and camping area, using nearly identical phrasing and descriptions, but presented it as if he were sharing this knowledge for the first time. When Journey pressed him about their earlier encounter, his friendly demeanor began to change, and she detected a subtle shift in his tone that made her increasingly uncomfortable. What had begun as confusion about a simple case of forgetfulness evolved into something far more disturbing as the man's responses became more defensive and his body language more aggressive. He began to question Journey's own memory and suggested that she might be confusing him with someone else, despite the fact that his physical appearance, clothing, and hiking gear were identical to what she had observed during their first meeting. His voice took on a different quality, becoming colder and more menacing, even as his words remained superficially polite and helpful. As the conversation continued, Journey became increasingly aware that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. The man's facial features, while identical to those she remembered from their first encounter, seemed somehow different in subtle ways that she could not quite define. His eyes appeared darker, his smile more forced, and his overall presence felt wrong in a way that activated every survival instinct she had developed during her years of solo hiking in remote areas. When Journey finally ended the conversation and continued hiking north, she could feel the man watching her as she walked away, his gaze following her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She resisted the urge to look back, focusing instead on reaching the water source he had described and finding a safe place to stop and process what had just happened. The feeling of being watched persisted for several minutes after she had walked out of sight, and she found herself constantly checking over her shoulder for any sign that she was being followed. The water source, when she finally reached it, was exactly as the man had described during both of their conversations. Located in a small clearing surrounded by the kind of level tent sites that were ideal for camping. But despite the practical appeal of the location, Journey felt deeply uncomfortable about the prospect of spending the night in a place that had been recommended by someone whose behavior had been so disturbing and inexplicable. As she filled her water bottles and took a brief rest, Journey tried to develop logical explanations for what she had experienced. Perhaps the man had a medical condition that affected his memory, or perhaps he was under the influence of medication that caused confusion and disorientation. Maybe he had been testing her reactions for reasons that she could not understand, or maybe she had simply misremembered details from their first conversation and had created confusion where none actually existed. But none of these explanations adequately accounted for the subtle but unmistakable changes in the man's demeanor and appearance during their second encounter, or for the feeling of menace that had surrounded him when she questioned his memory of their previous meeting. Something about the entire situation felt wrong in a way that went beyond simple confusion or medical issues, something that suggested she had encountered something that was not entirely human, despite its convincingly human appearance. That evening, as Journey set up camp at a different location several miles beyond the water source, she made a discovery that confirmed her worst suspicions about her mysterious encounters with the duplicate hiker. While reviewing the trail register at a shelter where she stopped for the night, she found an entry from a hiker using the same name as the man she had met, but the entry was dated 3 years earlier and included a note indicating that the writer had died in a hiking accident somewhere along this same section of trail. According to the trail register entry and subsequent notes from other hikers, the man whose name matched that of her mysterious encounter had fallen from a cliff near Pine Grove Furnace during a solo hiking trip in the spring of 2020. His body had eventually been recovered, but not before an extensive search and rescue operation that had involved volunteers from the local hiking community. Several hikers had left memorial notes in the trail register, describing him as an experienced and knowledgeable outdoorsman who had been beloved by his fellow trail enthusiasts. The physical description provided in the memorial notes matched exactly the appearance of the man Journey had encountered down to details about his hiking gear and his manner of speaking. Even more disturbing, the notes described his habit of providing detailed information about water sources and camping areas to fellow hikers, exactly the kind of helpful behavior he had displayed during both of their conversations. Journey spent a sleepless night in her tent, listening to every sound in the forest around her, and wondering whether her encounters with the duplicate hiker had been with some kind of ghost or spirit that continued to walk this section of trail 3 years after his death. She had heard stories about such phenomena from other hikers, tales of ghostly encounters with people who had died in the mountains, but whose spirits continued to interact with the living, usually in ways that seemed helpful and benevolent rather than threatening. But there had been nothing benevolent about the change in demeanor she had witnessed during her second encounter with the man. Nothing comforting about the cold menace that had replaced his initial friendliness when she questioned his memory. Whatever she had met on that trail was something that could mimic human behavior convincingly, enough to fool an experienced hiker, but which became hostile and dangerous when its deception was discovered. The next morning, Journey packed her gear and hiked out of the area as quickly as possible, abandoning her planned route and heading directly for the nearest road where she could arrange transportation back to civilization. She never completed her planned week-long hike, and she has never returned to that section of the Appalachian Trail near Pine Grove Furnace State Park. To this day, Journey cannot shake the feeling that something in those Pennsylvania mountains continues to walk the trail wearing the face and form of a man who died 3 years ago, approaching unsuspecting hikers with helpful advice and friendly conversation, but revealing its true nature only when its deception is challenged. She wonders how many other hikers have encountered the same duplicate figure, and whether any of them were unlucky enough to discover what happens when you spend the night in a camping area recommended by someone who should not exist. Jovi Richardson had always been fascinated by the intersection of technology and wilderness, which is what led her to carry a small portable radio during her hiking adventures, something that most 18-year-old hikers would never consider bringing on a solo backpacking trip. As a freshman at the University of Maryland studying communications engineering, she found that listening to distant radio stations during quiet evenings at remote campsites helped her understand signal propagation and atmospheric interference in ways that her textbooks could never fully explain. What she discovered during her first solo long-distance hike along the Appalachian Trail near South Mountain State Park in Maryland during the autumn of 2023 would challenge everything she thought she knew about radio technology and leave her questioning whether some frequencies can carry more than just conventional broadcasts. Jovi had planned her 3-day solo hiking trip as both a personal challenge and an opportunity to conduct some informal research into radio reception at various elevations and locations throughout the mountainous terrain of western Maryland. She carried a compact but sophisticated multi-band radio capable of receiving AM, FM, and shortwave frequencies, along with a telescoping antenna that could be extended for better reception when conditions allowed. Her plan was to document signal strength and station clarity at different elevations and times of day, creating a database that might be useful for her communication studies. The section of the Appalachian Trail she had chosen for her research runs through terrain that is rich in both natural beauty and historical significance. Passing near the ruins of old radio and television transmission facilities that had been built on South Mountain during the mid-20th century. Some of these facilities dated back to the early days of broadcast radio, when engineers had discovered that the elevated location and favorable atmospheric conditions around South Mountain made it ideal for long-distance signal transmission. Jovi established her first campsite on a Thursday evening near the ruins of what had once been a significant radio transmission complex, positioned on a ridge that offered excellent views across the Potomac Valley and into Virginia. The ruins consisted mainly of concrete foundations and the remains of several tall transmission towers, most of which had been dismantled decades earlier when the facility was decommissioned. A few of the smaller towers remained standing, their skeletal metal structures creating stark silhouettes against the evening sky. As darkness fell and Jovi settled into her campsite routine, she began experimenting with her radio equipment, scanning through various frequencies to document what stations could be received clearly at this elevation and location. The reception was excellent, much better than she had expected, with AM stations coming in clearly from hundreds of miles away and shortwave broadcasts reaching her from stations as distant as Europe and South America. She spent several hours taking notes and making recordings, fascinated by the way atmospheric conditions seemed to enhance signal propagation in ways that exceeded her theoretical expectations. It was sometime after midnight, as Jovi was preparing to pack up her radio equipment and get some sleep, that she first encountered the anomalous broadcast that would transform her peaceful research expedition into something far more disturbing. While scanning through the shortwave frequencies, she began picking up transmissions that seemed to be originating from much closer than the international stations she had been monitoring. The signals were strong and clear, but the content was unlike anything she had ever heard on any legitimate radio frequency. The broadcasts appeared to be emergency communications, urgent transmissions between search and rescue teams conducting operations in mountainous terrain that sounded remarkably similar to the area where she was camped. The voices were professional and organized, using standard emergency service protocols and terminology, but they were discussing search operations for hikers who had gone missing in locations that Jovi recognized from her own study of local trail maps and hiking guides. What made these transmissions particularly unsettling was that the missing persons they described seemed to match the profiles of real hikers who had disappeared in the Appalachian Mountains over the past several years. The search teams discussed finding abandoned campsites, personal belongings scattered along remote trails, and evidence of hikers who had simply vanished without leaving any clear indication of what had happened to them. The level of detail in these broadcasts was extraordinary, including specific coordinates, physical descriptions, and personal information that suggested access to official missing persons reports. As Jovi continued listening to these mysterious transmissions throughout the night, she began to realize that the broadcasts were not following normal temporal patterns. The emergency communications seemed to jump between different time periods, with some transmissions apparently describing search operations that had taken place years earlier, while others discussed missing hikers whose disappearances were much more recent. The voices and radio call signs changed frequently, but the overall character of the communications remained consistent: urgent, professional search and rescue operations for hikers who had vanished in the mountains. Most disturbing of all, the broadcasts began to include references to her own location and activities. Search teams discussed finding a young woman camping alone near the old radio transmission facility on South Mountain, describing her appearance, her equipment, and even details about her radio research project that no one else could possibly have known. The transmissions spoke of her as if she were already missing, as if search teams were actively looking for her, while she sat listening to their communications about her own disappearance. The voices on the radio began addressing her directly, calling her by name and providing detailed descriptions of her campsite, her tent color, and the specific radio equipment she was using. They seemed to know not only where she was, but what she was doing at any given moment. Commenting on her movements as she tried to adjust her antenna position or when she got up to check the security of her tent stakes, the broadcast created the terrifying impression that she was being watched by the very people who were discussing her disappearance on the radio. As dawn approached, the nature of the transmissions began to change in ways that pushed beyond mere surveillance into something that seemed to involve active prediction of future events. The search teams began discussing plans to recover Jovi's body from locations she had not yet visited, describing evidence they claimed to have found along sections of trail that were part of her planned hiking route for the following day. They spoke of her death as if it were an established fact, coordinating recovery operations for a body that had not yet been discovered because the events they described had not yet occurred. The radio voices described finding her abandoned campsite, her scattered equipment, and ultimately, her remains in a remote ravine that she recognized from her topographic maps as being several miles ahead on her intended hiking route. They discussed the cause of her death in clinical professional terms, speculating about whether she had fallen accidentally or had been the victim of the same unknown force that had claimed the other missing hikers whose disappearances they had been discussing throughout the night. When morning came and the sun began to rise over South Mountain, the mysterious transmissions gradually faded away, replaced by normal AM and FM broadcasts from conventional radio stations. Jovi packed her equipment quickly, abandoning her planned research project and her intended hiking route, choosing instead to take the shortest path back to the trailhead and her car. She could not shake the feeling that somewhere in the frequencies that surrounded South Mountain, search teams were still coordinating operations to recover her body from places she had never been, discussing her death as if it were inevitable rather than preventable. As she hiked out of the area, Jovi found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, half expecting to encounter the search and rescue teams whose voices she had heard on the radio, teams that seemed to exist in a temporal space that included both past and future events, but operated according to rules that normal reality could not accommodate. Every sound in the forest seemed potentially significant, every movement in her peripheral vision a possible sign that the predicted events were beginning to unfold exactly as the radio voices had described. When Jovi reached her car and drove away from South Mountain, she immediately checked online missing persons databases and news reports to see if she could find information about the hikers whose disappearances had been discussed in the mysterious broadcasts. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. Every missing person case mentioned in the radio transmissions corresponded to real disappearances that had occurred in the Appalachian Mountains over the past decade. The details she had heard matched official reports with frightening accuracy, including information that had never been released to the public. Most disturbing of all, when Jovi checked the database several weeks after her hiking trip, she found a new missing person report that described a young female communications student who had vanished while conducting radio research on South Mountain. The missing person's description, equipment, and last known location matched her own profile exactly, even though she was obviously safe and had never been reported missing by anyone. According to the official record, search teams were still actively looking for her body in the same remote ravine that had been described in the radio transmission she had heard that night. Jovi never returned to South Mountain, and she never attempted to contact the radio frequencies where she'd heard the impossible broadcasts about her own death. But sometimes, late at night, when atmospheric conditions are right for long-distance radio propagation. She finds herself wondering whether those search teams are still coordinating operations to recover her body, still discussing evidence of her disappearance, still broadcasting their urgent communications into a frequency space where past and future events exist simultaneously, and where the boundary between prediction and reality has become dangerously blurred. She has never been able to determine whether the radio transmissions were somehow predicting future events that might still occur, or whether they were broadcasts from an alternate timeline where her hiking trip had ended very differently. But she knows that somewhere in the radio spectrum that surrounds the ancient transmission facilities of South Mountain, search teams continue their work, looking for hikers who may not yet realize that they are already missing, broadcasting urgent communications about disappearances that exist in a temporal space beyond normal human understanding. Anakin Valdez had built his reputation as one of the most respected wilderness survival instructors in the southeastern United States through 15 years of leading groups safely through some of the most challenging terrain the Appalachian Mountains had to offer. At 25 years old, he possessed the kind of hard-earned expertise that came from countless nights spent in remote locations, teaching urban teenagers how to navigate, find water, build shelter, and most importantly, how to recognize and avoid the dangers that existed in wild places far from civilization. What happened during a routine survival training course near Blood Mountain in Georgia during the late autumn of 2023 would test not only his professional skills, but also his fundamental understanding of what kinds of dangers actually existed in the ancient forests of North Appalachia. The survival course Anakin was leading was part of a wilderness education program designed for high school students from Atlanta who had little or no experience with outdoor activities. The 5-day program was structured to gradually build confidence and skills, starting with basic techniques near established campsites and progressing to more challenging scenarios in increasingly remote locations. Blood Mountain, the highest peak on the Appalachian Trail in Georgia, offered ideal terrain for advanced survival training. With its combination of rugged topography, reliable water sources, and historical significance that helped students connect with the long tradition of human survival in these mountains. Anakin had led similar groups to this area dozens of times over the years, and he knew every trail, every reliable water source, and every potential hazard within a 10-mile radius of their planned campsite. The location he had selected for their final night was a remote area about 3 miles off the main Appalachian Trail, positioned in a natural hollow that provided both shelter from wind and access to a spring that had never been known to run dry, even during the driest summer seasons. The group of 12 students ranging in age from 15 to 17 had performed exceptionally well during the first 4 days of the program, demonstrating genuine enthusiasm for learning survival skills and showing remarkable progress in their ability to work together as a team. They had successfully completed challenges involving fire making, shelter construction, plant identification, and basic navigation, building the kind of confidence that Anakin knew would serve them well in any outdoor situation they might encounter in the future. It was on their final afternoon, as the group was setting up camp in the remote hollow and preparing for their last night in the wilderness, that Anakin first encountered the mysterious figure who would completely change the nature of their survival training experience. The students were scattered throughout the campsite, working in small groups to complete their assigned tasks of gathering firewood, setting up shelters, and preparing the area for cooking, when a man emerged from the forest and approached Anakin directly. The man appeared to be in his 60s or 70s with long, gray hair and a full beard that gave him the appearance of someone who had spent most of his life in the mountains. He was dressed in clothing that seemed to belong to an earlier era: heavy wool pants, a worn leather jacket, and boots that looked handmade rather than commercially manufactured. Most striking of all, he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of living in harmony with wild places, moving through the forest with barely a sound despite his substantial size and apparent age. What made the encounter immediately unsettling was not the man's appearance, which was unusual but not necessarily alarming, but rather the urgency and specificity of his warning. Without any preamble or introduction, the mountain man approached Anakin and began speaking in a low, serious tone that immediately commanded attention. He warned that the group needed to leave the area immediately, explaining that they had chosen to camp in a place where things hunt when the moon is dark and where the old rules still apply. The man's warning was detailed and specific, mentioning landmarks and terrain features that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the local area, but also referencing dangers that seemed to belong more to folklore and legend than to any modern understanding of wilderness hazards. He spoke of ancient predators that still roamed these mountains, creatures that had learned to avoid human contact during daylight hours, but became active and dangerous during the dark phase of the lunar cycle. According to the mysterious mountain man, the hollow where Anakin had established their campsite was part of a traditional hunting territory for something that he would only refer to as the Old One, a predator that had been known to the Cherokee people who had lived in these mountains for centuries before European settlement. The creature followed predictable patterns, becoming active during certain phases of the moon and targeting groups of humans who camped in specific locations that fell within its established territory. Anakin's initial reaction was to dismiss the warning as the eccentric advice of an old-timer who had spent too much time alone in the mountains and had perhaps begun to confuse local folklore with reality. The survival instructor in him recognized that there were legitimate dangers in these mountains, including black bears, venomous snakes, and the occasional mountain lion, but nothing that warranted the kind of urgent evacuation the mountain man was recommending. However, as the conversation continued, several factors began to convince Anakin that the warning deserved serious consideration. First, the man's knowledge of the local terrain was extraordinarily detailed and accurate, demonstrating the kind of familiarity that could only come from decades of experience in these specific mountains. He knew about water sources, seasonal animal migration patterns, and historical sites that were not marked on any maps and were known only to a few local experts. Second, the man was able to provide specific information about previous incidents in the area that Anakin was able to verify through his own knowledge of local history. He mentioned several cases of unexplained disappearances and unusual animal attacks that had occurred in this region over the past several decades, incidents that had been documented by park rangers and local law enforcement but had never received widespread publicity. Most convincing of all, the mountain man's demeanor was entirely serious and professional, without any of the theatrical elements that Anakin would have expected from someone who was simply trying to frighten a group of urban teenagers with local ghost stories. The man spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of someone providing genuine safety information, the way an experienced guide might warn about dangerous weather conditions or unstable terrain. As the mountain man continued his warning, he began to provide specific details about the signs that would indicate the approach of the creature he was describing. According to his account, the first indication would be the complete absence of normal forest sounds. as all the smaller animals would sense the predator's presence and either flee the area or hide in complete silence. This would be followed by a dramatic drop in temperature, even on warm nights, as the creature's presence somehow affected the local microclimate. The mountain man explained that the creature was primarily active during the hours between midnight and dawn, and that it was drawn to campfires and human voices, but that it could be deterred by certain actions if those actions were taken before the creature had fully committed to an attack. He provided detailed instructions about specific precautions that could be effective, including the arrangement of certain types of stones around the campsite and the burning of particular plants that grew wild in these mountains. What made the warning truly disturbing was the man's insistence that the current lunar phase, which was approaching the new moon, represented the most dangerous time for the creature's activity. According to his account, the thing that hunted in these mountains was most active during the darkest nights, when moonlight would not reveal its approach, and when its natural camouflage would be most effective. As evening approached and the students began preparing their dinner around the campfire, Anakin found himself paying much closer attention to the sounds and atmosphere of the forest around their campsite. At first, everything seemed normal, with the usual evening chorus of insects and the occasional call of night birds beginning their nocturnal activities. But as darkness fell and the temperature began to drop, he began to notice subtle changes that seemed to match the mountain man's description of warning signs. The forest sounds gradually diminished until the area around their campsite was enveloped in a silence that seemed unnatural and oppressive. Even the insects that had been active earlier in the evening seemed to have disappeared completely, leaving behind a quiet that was so profound it made every small sound from their campfire seem unnaturally loud. The temperature drop was also more dramatic than weather conditions would have predicted, with the air becoming noticeably colder despite the fact that it had been a warm day and there was no wind. Most disturbing of all, the students began to comment on feeling like they were being watched, expressing an uneasiness that seemed to affect the entire group simultaneously. These were urban teenagers who had no particular sensitivity to wilderness conditions, yet they were all experiencing the same sense of unease that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with their environment. As the night progressed, additional signs began to appear that seemed to confirm the mountain man's warnings. Small animals that had been attracted to their campsite earlier in the evening, including squirrels and chipmunks that had been scavenging for food scraps, disappeared completely. Even more ominously, the group began to find evidence of something large moving through the forest around their campsite, including broken branches and disturbed vegetation that suggested the passage of something much larger than any known wildlife in the area. The final confirmation of the mountain man's warning came around midnight, when one of the students who had gotten up to visit the latrine area reported seeing something moving through the trees just beyond the range of their flashlight. According to the student's account, the movement was deliberate and purposeful, suggesting something that was actively stalking their campsite rather than simply passing through the area. At that point, Anakin made the decision to take the mountain man's advice seriously and begin implementing the protective measures that had been recommended. Working quietly with the older students, he arranged stones around the perimeter of their campsite according to the specific pattern the mountain man had described, and he added certain aromatic plants to their campfire that were supposed to create a deterrent effect. The protective measures seemed to work, or at least something caused the threatening presence to withdraw from the immediate area around their campsite. The oppressive silence gradually gave way to more normal forest sounds. The temperature began to return to expected levels, and the students reported feeling less anxious and more comfortable in their surroundings. When morning came, Anakin led the group out of the area as quickly as possible, abandoning their planned final day of survival training and heading directly back to the trailhead where their transportation was waiting. During the hike out, they discovered additional evidence of whatever had been threatening their campsite during the night, including massive claw marks on trees around the hollow and tracks in soft earth that were unlike anything in any wildlife guide. Anakin never saw the mysterious mountain man again, and he never returned to that particular hollow for survival training courses. But he has never forgotten the warning he received, and he has never again dismissed local folklore and traditional knowledge as mere superstition. He now understands that in places as ancient and wild as the Appalachian Mountains, there are dangers that exist beyond the scope of modern wilderness education, and that sometimes the most important survival skill is knowing when to listen to warnings from those who have learned to read the deeper signs that these mountains provide to those who understand their language. Indy Morrison had always been fascinated by the acoustic properties of natural rock formations, an interest that had developed during her college geology courses and had continued to influence her choice of hiking destinations throughout her years of solo backpacking adventures. At 26 years old, she was completing her final section hike of the Appalachian Trail and had specifically chosen the Vermont portion near Killington Peak because she had read about the numerous caves and rock shelters that dotted the landscape in this region, many of which were said to produce unusual echoes and sound effects that attracted both serious speleologists and casual hiking enthusiasts. What she discovered in one particular cave during a violent October storm in 2023 would forever change her understanding of how sound behaves in these ancient geological formations and leave her questioning whether some echoes can carry more than just reflected noise. Indy was 3 days into a planned 5-day solo hike through the Green Mountains of Vermont, following a section of the Appalachian Trail that passes through some of the most geologically interesting terrain in the entire northeastern United States. The area around Killington Peak is characterized by complex limestone formations that have been carved and shaped by millions of years of water action, creating a landscape riddled with caves, sinkholes, and underground drainage systems that make the region a paradise for anyone interested in karst geology and speleological phenomena. The weather had been unseasonably warm for October when Indy began her hike, with clear skies and moderate temperatures that made the challenging terrain both enjoyable and manageable. She had been making excellent progress on her planned itinerary and had been looking forward to exploring some of the documented cave systems that lay just off the main trail, features that were marked on her geological survey maps but were not widely known to casual hikers who typically stayed on the established trail system. It was on the afternoon of her third day that the weather situation changed dramatically and unexpectedly, with clear skies giving way to towering thunderclouds that built up with remarkable speed over the mountainous terrain. What started as distant rumbling quickly developed into a full-scale thunderstorm, with heavy rain, dangerous lightning, and wind gusts that made hiking both uncomfortable and potentially hazardous. Indy found herself caught in the open during the worst of the storm, several miles from the nearest established shelter, and in need of immediate protection from the lightning that was striking with alarming frequency on the exposed ridges around Killington Peak. It was during her desperate search for shelter that Indy discovered the cave that would become the site of her most disturbing wilderness experience. The entrance was located about 50 yards off the main trail, hidden behind a screen of mountain laurel and barely visible even to someone who was actively searching for geological features. The opening was large enough for a person to enter comfortably, and a quick examination with her flashlight revealed that the cave extended back into the mountainside much farther than she had initially expected. Under normal circumstances, Indy would have been much more cautious about entering an unfamiliar cave system, particularly as a solo hiker with limited emergency resources. But the intensity of the storm outside made the cave seem like the only reasonable option for shelter, and her geological training had taught her to recognize signs of structural stability that indicated the formation was unlikely to collapse or present immediate danger to someone taking temporary shelter. The interior of the cave proved to be much more extensive and complex than its modest entrance had suggested, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages and evidence of significant water action that had carved elaborate formations throughout the limestone bedrock. Most remarkably, the cave possessed acoustic properties that were unlike anything Indy had ever experienced, even during her previous explorations of documented cave systems in other parts of the country. Even the smallest sounds seemed to be amplified and extended far beyond their normal duration, with simple movements like adjusting her backpack or unfolding her rain gear, creating echoes that persisted for minutes rather than seconds. When Indy spoke aloud to test the acoustic properties, her voice returned to her from multiple directions with such clarity and persistence that it seemed as if several people were speaking from different locations throughout the cave system. Initially, Indy was fascinated by the acoustic phenomenon and spent considerable time experimenting with different sounds and observing how they were reflected and modified by the cave's unique geometry. She clapped her hands, called out various phrases, and even sang short songs, marveling at the way the cave seemed to capture and replay every sound with remarkable fidelity and duration. The experience was unlike anything she had encountered in her previous cave explorations, and she began to suspect that the specific mineral composition and structural characteristics of this particular formation created conditions that were ideal for sound preservation and amplification. But as the hours passed and the storm continued to rage outside, Indy began to notice that the cave's acoustic properties were producing effects that went far beyond simple echo and reverberation. Her own voice, when it returned to her from the depths of the cave system, sometimes seemed to be altered in subtle but disturbing ways, as if the echoes were not merely reflecting her words, but were somehow modifying them to create entirely different messages. More unsettling still, the cave began to produce sounds that Indy had never made, voices that seemed to be engaged in conversations that had nothing to do with her current presence in the cave. At first, she assumed that these were echoes from her earlier vocalizations that were being distorted and delayed by the complex acoustics of the cave system. But as she listened more carefully, she began to realize that the voices were discussing topics and using vocabulary that she had never spoken aloud. The mysterious voices seemed to represent multiple different people, both male and female, speaking in accents and dialects that suggested they came from various time periods and regional backgrounds. Some of the voices used archaic language patterns that sounded like they belonged to the 19th century, while others employed more modern speech patterns but discussed events and places that Indy knew nothing about. All of the voices seemed to be engaged in serious, urgent conversations, discussing matters that apparently related to survival situations, emergency rescues, and dangerous encounters in mountainous wilderness areas. As the phenomenon intensified, Indy began to recognize that some of the voices were describing hiking experiences and wilderness emergencies that sounded remarkably similar to documented incidents that had occurred in the Vermont mountains over the past several decades. The voices discussed specific trail locations, weather conditions, and rescue operations with a level of detail and accuracy that suggested they were based on real events rather than fictional scenarios. Most disturbing of all, the cave began to produce echoes of conversations that seemed to involve Indy herself, but conversations that she had never actually participated in. She heard her own voice discussing hiking plans, emergency situations, and personal details with people she had never met, engaged in conversations that seemed to be taking place at times, and locations that did not correspond to her actual experiences. The temporal aspects of the phenomenon became even more confusing when the cave began producing what appeared to be echoes from future conversations. Discussions that involved Indy's voice, but described events that had not yet occurred. She heard herself describing the conclusion of her current hiking trip, discussing details about trail conditions and weather that she had not yet encountered, and even providing information about her planned activities after returning home from Vermont. These future echoes were remarkably specific and detailed, describing not only her immediate hiking plans, but also longer-term personal and professional developments that she had been considering but had never discussed with anyone. The cave seemed to be somehow accessing and reflecting not only sounds that had been made in the past, but also sounds that would be made in the future, creating a temporal echo chamber that operated according to rules that conventional physics could not explain. The climax of Indy's terrifying experience occurred when the cave began producing echoes that described her own death in the very cave where she was taking shelter. She heard her own voice, distorted and desperate, calling for help and describing a cave-in that had trapped her far from the entrance with no possibility of rescue. The future echo provided horrifying details about her final hours, describing her growing panic as she realized that no one knew her exact location and that the cave entrance had been sealed by falling rocks triggered by the continuing storm. According to the prophetic echo, Indy's body would eventually be discovered by other hikers months later, but only after an extensive search operation that would involve multiple rescue teams and considerable media attention. The echo described the exact location where her remains would be found, the condition of her equipment, and even the contents of the final journal entries that she would write while trapped in the darkness, waiting for a rescue that would never come. The psychological impact of hearing her own voice describe her impending death in such vivid and specific detail was more than Indy could endure. Despite the continuing storm outside, she gathered her gear and fled the cave immediately, convinced that staying any longer would somehow cause the prophetic echoes to become reality. The rain was still falling heavily, and lightning continued to strike dangerously close to the exposed ridges. But Indy was more afraid of the temporal echoes than she was of the weather. Her panicked flight from the cave led her directly into the path of the continuing storm, and she spent several terrifying hours hiking through dangerous conditions before finally reaching the safety of an established trail shelter. The experience left her exhausted, soaked, and deeply shaken, but alive and unharmed, despite the warnings contained in the cave's future echoes. When Indy reached civilization 2 days later and was able to research the geological features of the area where she had taken shelter, she discovered that the cave she had encountered was not documented in any official speleological surveys of the region. According to geological service maps and cave registry databases, no significant cave systems existed in the exact location where she had spent those terrifying hours, listening to echoes from past and future conversations. More puzzling still when Indy returned to the area several weeks later with a local hiking group, hoping to relocate the cave and document its unusual acoustic properties. The entrance was nowhere to be found. The screen of mountain laurel where she remembered finding the opening was still there, but behind it was only solid rock face with no indication that a cave had ever existed at that location. The final confirmation of the supernatural nature of her experience came when Indy reviewed the digital photographs she had taken during her hiking trip, hoping to find some visual record of the cave entrance or its interior features. While most of her photos from the Vermont hike were normal and properly exposed, the images she had taken inside the cave showed impossible anomalies that defied logical explanation. In several photos, the cave appeared to be illuminated by light sources that had not been present when the pictures were taken, revealing architectural details and formations that Indy had never seen during her time in the cave. Most disturbing of all, some of the photos showed additional people in the cave with her, shadowy figures that appeared to be engaged in the conversations she had been hearing as echoes. People who had definitely not been physically present during her terrifying experience. To this day, Indy cannot explain what happened to her in that temporal echo chamber hidden somewhere in the mountains of Vermont. She has never found any scientific literature that adequately accounts for the acoustic phenomena she experienced, and she has never been able to relocate the cave where past, present, and future seem to exist simultaneously in the form of reflected sound waves that carried impossible information across barriers of time and space. Sometimes, during quiet moments in her current life, Indy still hears faint echoes of conversations that have not yet taken place, and she wonders whether her experience in that Vermont cave somehow altered her relationship with time itself, leaving her permanently connected to acoustic phenomena that exist beyond the boundaries of normal human perception. She has never returned to Vermont, and she has never again sought shelter in unfamiliar caves, knowing that some geological formations may preserve more than just the physical evidence of ancient processes, and that some echoes carry voices from times and places that human understanding is not meant to access. Malia Rodriguez had always been the type of person who refused to let a little bad weather ruin her plans, which is exactly the attitude that led her into one of the most terrifying experiences of her 19 years on this earth. As a sophomore at East Tennessee State University and an active member of the campus hiking club, she'd spent countless weekends exploring the trails that wind through the Great Smoky Mountains, building both her endurance and her confidence in the backcountry. What happened to her during a solo hike near Clingman's Dome in late November of 2023 would shake that confidence to its core and leave her questioning whether some things in the wilderness are better left undisturbed. The day had started out promisingly enough, with Malia and 3 other members of the hiking club planning a challenging day hike from Newfound Gap to the Appalachian Trail Shelter at Icewater Spring. It was meant to be a conditioning hike in preparation for a winter break trip to the Smokies, and despite the forecast calling for possible afternoon thunderstorms, the group had decided to proceed with their plans. They were all experienced hikers who had dealt with mountain weather before, and the trail conditions were reported as good despite the season. The problems began around noon when the predicted weather front moved in faster and more aggressively than the meteorologists had anticipated. What started as light drizzle quickly escalated into a steady cold rain that made the already challenging trail treacherous and uncomfortable. The temperature dropped nearly 20 degrees in the span of an hour, and the wind picked up significantly, making every step a battle against the elements. One by one, Malia's hiking companions decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and chose to turn back rather than risk hypothermia or injury on the increasingly slippery trail. But Malaya had been looking forward to this hike for weeks, and she was determined not to let a little rain defeat her. She had proper gear, including a high-quality rain jacket and waterproof boots, and she felt confident in her ability to handle